inner tangle and the outer tangle are both entangled in a tangle, who is there that can untangle this tangle? Good morning. These are the first words that we find when we open up the big book called The Path of Purification by Buddha Gosa, 5th century. And today I'm going to explain this whole book. I'm going to untangle it in 30 minutes. So our theme for this month is to talk about Theravada Buddhism. Theravada, 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 Vada meaning school. Theravada is the school of the elders. In Chinese, Xiankuan, the head seat school. Head seat was occupied by the elder. So Theravada Buddhism is the school that traces its roots most closely to the original teachings of the Buddha. We know that the Buddha lived in the 6th century BCE, passed away around 480 BCE. After his passing, there was a council where there was a recitation of the words of the Buddha, still not written down. And then 100 years later, another council. By that time, in that 100 years, there had been already some divisions, some sectarian divides, but still the original elders that were trained by who were the original trainers, trained the new elders, the arahats. They held very much to the original teachings of the Buddha. And then, about 250 years later, another council, because more divisions were taking place, but still the Theravadan tradition was maintained. So by that 250-year period, then depending upon whether or not you go by the counting of the northern schools or the southern schools, but there were either 18 or 20 different schools of Buddhism that were in existence about 250 years after the life of the Buddha. And then, of course, many of these schools started to fade out, but still the Theravadan tradition was maintained. A few of the schools would merge with each other, fade out. There were a few of the schools in addition to Theravadan that continued on and then evolved into what we now look at as modern schools of Mahayana Buddhism. But that's for another time. But the Theravadan school remained. And even after the evolution of Mahayana Buddhism with Nagarjuna and Vasubandhu and Asanga from the 1st to the 4th century, Theravadan Buddhism remained. particularly strong in India, stronger in Sri Lanka, and then spread to Southeast Asia, where it became the predominant school in Laos, Cambodia, Burma, Vietnam, although Vietnam became involved with Mahayana as well. But Theravadan Buddhism remained, and many of the schools that came after, particularly in Japan and Tibet, really did not study so much the original schools. They had their own teachers, their own commentaries, and so it's very possible that a person could go to a Japanese or Tibetan tradition and study very, very little about the original teachings of the Buddha, not read very much of the original words of the Buddha, let alone the original commentaries on the Buddha, because they had their own teachers who gave their own commentaries. Now, Chinese Buddhism, a little different than that, because Chinese Buddhism really focused a lot on integrating the Theravadan view as well as the Mahayana view, and did not see so much differentiation. They realized that one built upon the other, and if you're going to build a building, you need to have a very good foundation. That good foundation means that we need to study the original teachings of the Buddha, the original words of the Buddha, and the commentaries on those practices. And this is particularly true of Chan Buddhism, later known as Zen, of which we are part here. So when we look at the original commentaries that go back and try to examine how to put into practice the teachings of the Buddha, we come to one of the most important of those early compilations, which is the Path of Purification, the Visuddhimagga. Now, this text is particularly interesting for those people who practice meditation, whereas many other commentaries go into philosophical differences and explain certain philosophical principles, psychological principles. The Path of Purification really is very much focused on how to meditate, how to enter into higher stages of meditation, and how to gain wisdom in this state. So whereas the very first section of the book talks about virtue and morality, which is the correct order of things in understanding the Eightfold Path, the majority of the book, lots of pages, are devoted to how to practice meditation, how to enter into the higher states of concentration. And this is explained mostly in a didactic way, very precise, using very precise terminology, and explaining it step by step by step, so detailed that even myself, when I read this book, after 1/2 hour, I want to take a nap. It's very, very intense. I don't take a nap, but I instead go and practice meditation. because my mind can only take in so much. This book is really a commentary on the teachings of the Buddha, and so if you don't know the teachings of the Buddha, if you don't know the original teachings, when he begins to give explanations, very difficult to understand. I'll give you a short example of this. In the Path of Purification, there's a story, a metaphor that's given about a person who is a plowman, a person who has an ox and he has a plow. For those people who understand Zen or Chan Buddhism, we know that the ox later becomes one of the very important metaphors for finding the way to train one's mind. So in this text, there's a story about a plowman. But if you don't know the original story of the plowman, then this story doesn't make so much sense. So the original story about the plowman from the original suttas is that there's a fellow who is yoking up 500 ox, and he's about to plow. And the plowing that he's doing is he's going to be growing crops for the monastics. And he sees this monk standing watching. He doesn't know maybe that the monk is the Buddha. He saw the Blessed One standing, and he said to him, I, contemplative, he doesn't call him the Blessed One, he just calls him a contemplative. I plow and I sow, and having plowed and sowed, I eat. You too, contemplative, should plow and sow. Having plowed and sowed, you will eat. So this plowman, he's being a little critical of the contemplative here. And the Buddha responds to this person. He says, I too, Brahman, he refers to him as a Brahman because he's not one of the disciples of the Buddha. He's from the class of people who worship Brahma. He says, I too, Brahman, plow and sow. Having plowed and sowed, I eat. And then the plowman says, but contemplative, I don't see Master Gautama's yoke or plow. I guess at this point he realizes who he is. Plowshare, goat, or oxen, and yet Master Gautama says this, I too, Brahman, plow and sow, having plowed and sow, I eat. And then the Buddha says, so then the plowman says to him in verse, you claim to be a plowman, but I don't see you plowing. Being asked, tell us about your plowing, so that we may know your plowing. And then the Buddha responds, conviction is my seed, austerity my rain, discernment my yoke and plow, modesty my pole, my mind my yoke. And it goes on. So that's the original story. So in the Visuddhimagga in chapter 8, verse 213, there is this story about a plowman. This is the commentary. Suppose a plowman, after doing some plowing, sent his oxen free to graze and sat down to rest in the shade, and then his oxen would soon go into the forest. Now, what would the skilled plowman do? He wants to get his oxen back. And the story goes on that the unskilled plowman would go chasing after each one of his oxen and try to get them back. But the skilled plowman, he goes to the pond where all the ox go to drink. And when he gets there and all the oxen are there drinking and they're calm and peaceful, it's very easy to yoke them and then take them back to where they need to go. this becomes a metaphor for the person practicing mindfulness. When the mind becomes calm, it's much easier to train the mind. If a person goes after each one of their thoughts, each one of their problems, each one of their worries, one by one, chasing after them, how much energy and work will the plowman spend trying to catch this? Oh, I have to solve this problem. I have to catch this oxen. Oh, now I have to get this one. Now it'll be endless, the number of days and hours spent trying to do that. But if a person is able to sit calmly and train the mind by the pond, then each one of the troubles come easy to untangle them. So this is the metaphor that we find in the path of purification. Now, this particular text goes through step-by-step training of how to do this. So about the year 430, Buddhaghosa, the author of this, arrived in Sri Lanka and he began to write commentaries. And he wrote them in the language of Sri Lanka, which was Pali, which is close to the language that the Buddha spoke, and it was the language that all of the monastics knew. The first several chapters are on virtue, and I'm not going to talk about that specifically. We have a retreat next week where we're going to be talking about the first, really focusing a lot on the first part of the Eightfold Path, the cultivation of right speech and right action and right livelihood. But here I want to start with just a little bit on chapter 3, in which he talks about access and absorption in concentration. And then in chapter 8, he goes into the mindfulness of the body in 32 parts in great detail, and explains mindfulness of the breath in 16 parts in great detail. And then by chapter 9, he talks about the 4 great divine abidings, the term that he uses. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this in the few minutes that we have remaining, so that we have a better understanding of the path of practice. When a person begins to sit to practice meditation mindfulness, and they have an understanding of the path, they realize that mindfulness is not just about the mind getting calm. Mindfulness is not just about gaining insight. Those things are important. But mindfulness is a foundational step in order to enter into higher levels, deeper levels of concentration, where the insight becomes even greater and greater until finally the person has what's called full awakening. So in Buddhism, we say that each person is capable of full awakening. Each person can be a Buddha. Buddha means an awakened one. So the word Buddha means awakened person. What are we awake to? We're awake to how to stop suffering. That is the liberation, how to stop suffering. So, in order to do that, we need to know how to enter into deeper states of concentration. This can be very helpful. So, there are two stages to this. There is coming up to the door of concentration and being able to walk in and just be in the anteroom, the entry hall of concentration. And this is called access concentration. And then a person enters into deeper states called jhanas, deeper into the room of the house of enlightenment, so to speak. And these are called the absorption states. There are 8 of these states. Finally, ultimate, the 9th one would be full enlightenment. But the first is to be able to enter into access concentration. Now, to enter into full absorption concentration really requires most people, depending on their causes and conditions, most people are not going to enter into absorption concentration because they're not able to sit long enough. You might say to yourself, well, how long can I comfortably sit? Not just physically, but mentally, before my mind wants to just stop. For me today, 39 minutes. I wanted to stop. If I go to the retreat, then I know that I'm ready to sit for longer periods of time. Maybe a few days one can sit on and off. But to be able to enter into the absorption states, I think for most people you need to sit longer. For me, I think I would need to sit for at least 3 months in order to be able to have a better understanding. But access concentration is possible with some retreats. A person can enter into access concentration. Access concentration, easiest way for lay people to enter into access concentration is to be able to practice mindfulness of the breath, mindfulness of the body, and then mindfulness of the 4 great mind states. This is what's outlined in this text. How to enter into access concentration using the 4 great mind states after the person has practiced mindfulness of the body and mindfulness of the breath. This first great mind state, loving kindness, compassion, altruistic joy, equanimity. So when a person can enter into those great mind states and remain stable in that mind state, then we can say, oh, the person is approaching access concentration. The mind is not wandering around trying to find each and every little ox, the answer to all of the little ox, where they're going. How do I find this one, this one, this one? The mind will wander and wander and wander doing that. So the mind no longer wanders so much. So the instructions that Buddha Gosa gives on how to do this is very, very fine detail. When he talks about the mindfulness of the body in 32 parts, he goes through the body in great detail. The hair on the head, the hair on the body, the teeth, the nails, the skin. This is the first section called the 5 skin pentad, 5 parts relating to the skin. and so on and so forth, going through the different parts of the body related to what he calls the earth element, all of the physical form parts of the body that are related to the earth. And then this includes going into the internal organs, and then contemplating the liquid parts of the body. 12 liquid parts, from the bile to the phlegm, to the tears and the snot and the saliva and the pus and the grease on the skin, the blood, urine, all of the different parts of the body. Being able to focus on them without being distracted. And then being able to go into the mindfulness of the breath. Mindfulness of the breath is introduced usually before mindfulness of the body, but usually just in its preliminary form of just paying attention to the in and out breath, the rising. If we use the Chinese system, the arising, abiding, changing, and ceasing. But when we do it in the 16 parts, we learn how to focus our attention even in a more refined way. Not the 16 parts of the breath, but being able to bring the breath to understanding our physical habit energy, our feeling habit energy, our mental habit energy, and how to go into cessation. These are generally cessation are the last of the, if you divide it into 4 parts, renunciations. So this very detailed, extremely detailed discussion on this find in the Path of Purification. And then finally, in section, now finally, just in the middle of the book, really, at that point, he's talking about entering into access, concentration. He talks about how to practice mindfulness, of loving kindness, for example, of compassion, altruistic joy, and equanimity. Now, this particular section also contains very important teaching on what's called the near enemy and far enemy. So each one of these practices, like loving kindness, for example, has what's called a near enemy and a far enemy. And the near enemy is described, we'll start with the far enemy. The far enemy is described as a person that we might see far off in the distance. We know that this person is trouble and we stay away from them. And the near enemy is someone who travels along with us, alongside us. We think that they're a good friend, but they are pulling us in the wrong direction. I like to tell the story of how I was going to visit Thanissaro Bhikkhu in his monastery in Southern California, outside of San Diego, in a place called Escondido. Actually, not in Escondido, but not too far from that. And I was traveling with a fellow who has done a lot of meditation and traveling in Southeast Asia. His name's Bob McClure, and he's trained in Stanford University in practice of, from a group called Compassion and Altruistic Research and Education. Yeah, very, very good fellow. And we're traveling along to go to Thanissaro Bhikkhu's monastery, and we got a little lost. And we're driving, and we pass a casino, and we're driving around, and Bob says to me, he says, "You know, Don, I understand the far enemy pretty well. I know that that's the opposite force. but I don't understand the near enemy so well. I said, oh, that's not so difficult, but I think if we're going to really discuss the near enemy, we should turn around, go back to the casino, and spend the day gambling. And he said, oh, now I understand the near enemy. Because it looks like a friend. It looks like it's going to be fun. But in fact, it leads us astray. So the far enemy of loving kindness is ill will. Maybe we've experienced this. A dear person, somebody that we are supposed to have loving kindness towards, they do something that hurts our feelings, and so we want to get them back. Teach them a lesson. So we use ill will, anger. We treat them the way that we've been treated, thinking to ourselves, oh, that will teach them a lesson. But in fact, what happens most of the time is that the person responds even more strongly with their own anger and ill will. So this is called the far enemy. Now the near enemy of loving kindness is to be overly attached, to want more and more. A person who loves their child so much they don't want to let their child out of their sight. Don't want them to go off and explore the world, even when they become an adult. Too much loving kindness can prevent a person from growing. Too much attachment. In compassion, too, there is the near and far enemy. The far enemy is cruelty, actually taking pleasure in harming another person. And the near enemy of compassion is actually caring so much that we become overcome by our own caring. We become overwhelmed, caring so much about the other person. Then it becomes all about us, about our pain, about what they're going through. And their own experience is lost, then we lose our compassion for them. Altruistic joy also, far enemy. When altruistic joy is seeing the good qualities in another person and wanting to nurture them, and then being joyful that you have been able to do that. Jealousy, envy, and resentment are the far enemies. But becoming too exuberant, praising too much, flattery too much, and trying to compare yourself with that other person, this becomes the near enemy of altruistic joy. And in equanimity also, the far enemy is having too much attachment, aversion, or craving or clinging, so that one's life goes up and down with every positive or negative thing that happens. And the opposite of that, near enemy, is the very subtle tendency to become indifferent. I don't care. This is a near enemy of equanimity. So equanimity is in the middle, but it includes loving kindness, compassion, altruistic joy. Equanimity is full of those things and still does not become attached. So the description of how to attain those four great mind states is included in this text. So this is all rooted in the original Buddha's teaching. The Buddha talks about loving kindness, compassion, altruistic joy, and equanimity, how to attain it, and here deeper and deeper commentary about this practice. So, I invite you to take a nibble, a small bite of the path of purification when you have a chance. Don't try to digest it all at once. You'll need a lot of medicine to keep you from becoming sick. You try to eat it all at once. It's fairly deep and takes a tremendous amount of patience. But I wanted to give you a little bit of introduction so you wouldn't be frightened of it. May all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all beings never be separated from the altruistic joy, which is free from suffering. And may all beings dwell in the great equanimity, which is free from attachment, aversion,